There is a moment, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, when a person stops being who they were. Not with fireworks, not with a thunderclap from the sky. Just a small, internal shift, so subtle that even the person experiencing it might not notice at first, and yet from that moment on, nothing about them is quite the same again. Henry Drummond spent his life chasing that moment, trying to understand it, trying to explain it to people who had either forgotten it was possible or never believed it could happen to them. And what he found, what he wrote down more than a century ago in a small book called The New Man, still has the strange power to reach into a person's chest and rearrange something. This is that story, told the way it deserves to be told, slowly, honestly, and with room to breathe. Henry Drummond was, by trade, a scientist. He studied biology. He understood evolution. He stood in lecture halls and talked about cells and organisms and the long, patient march of life adapting to its world. But he was also, by conviction, a man who believed in something beyond the visible world. And instead of treating these two parts of himself as enemies, he did something almost nobody else in his era dared to do. He let them talk to each other. He took the laws he saw operating in nature, growth, struggle, adaptation, death, and rebirth, and he asked a question that still unsettles people today. What if these same laws govern the inner life as well? What if becoming a better person, a truer person, a new person, isn't a matter of willpower or moral effort alone, but something closer to biology, something that grows the way a living thing grows, according to real and discoverable laws? That question is the quiet engine underneath everything in this book. And it starts, as so many great insights do, with a very ordinary observation. Drummond noticed that most people who try to change themselves fail, not because they don't want it badly enough, but because they're going about it in the wrong way entirely. They treat their bad habits like weeds to be pulled, one at a time, with clenched teeth and gritted resolve. Pull the anger, pull the pride, pull the fear. And for a while it seems to work, until the weed grows right back, often thicker than before. Drummond looked at this pattern, so familiar to anyone who has ever tried and failed to become someone better, and he offered a different way of seeing it. You don't kill weeds by fighting them one at a time forever. You kill them by planting something else in that same soil, something that grows so full and so strong that the weeds simply have no room left to live. This is the first quiet gift of the book, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on, because it changes the entire emotional weight of trying to become a better person. It is not a war of suppression. It is an act of cultivation. Think of a person who has spent years trying to stop being anxious by telling themselves, over and over, stop worrying. It rarely works, does it? The mind doesn't respond well to a command to simply stop feeling something. But give that same mind something else to hold on to, a genuine sense of purpose, a real connection to another person. Something worth pouring attention into, and the anxiety, without ever being directly confronted, begins to lose its grip. Not because it was defeated, but because it was outgrown. Drummond takes this idea and roots it in the story of the Apostle Paul, a man whose transformation is one of the most famous conversion stories in human history. But Drummond isn't interested in the theatrics of that story, the blinding light on the road, the voice from the sky. He's interested in what happened after. Because a man doesn't simply flip a switch and become entirely new the moment he falls off his horse. Paul spent years afterward, learning, struggling, being shaped, slowly becoming the person whose letters would eventually be read by millions of people he would never meet. And it's in one of those letters that Drummond finds the phrase that gives this book its name. If any man be in a particular relationship, a particular connection, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away, all things are become new. What strikes Drummond, and what should strike us too, is the word creature, not creation as an event, but creature as a kind of being, alive, growing, changing over time the way every living thing changes over time. This wasn't meant to describe a single instant of transformation. It was meant to describe an entire unfolding process, the way a seed becomes a tree, becomes a forest, given enough time and the right conditions. And that reframing alone should offer some relief to anyone who has ever felt like a failure, because their transformation into someone better didn't happen all at once, in one dramatic moment, but instead in small stumbling steps, 2 forward, 1 back, again and again. There's a story worth imagining here, the kind of story Drummond himself liked to use, plain and human. Picture a man who has spent his whole life being quick to anger. It's cost him friendships, it's cost him peace at home, it's made him someone people are careful around. He tries, sincerely tries, to fix it. He reads books on patience. He counts to 10. He apologizes, again and again, after every outburst, meaning it every time. And still it happens again. What Drummond would say to this man isn't that he needs more willpower. He would say that anger, in this man's life, has become the only thing growing in that particular field of his heart. And until something else is planted there, something he actually cares about more than his own irritation, the anger will keep winning. Not because it's stronger than his intentions, but because it's the only thing with roots. This is where Drummond's scientific mind becomes so valuable to his spiritual insight. In nature, nothing grows in a vacuum. Every living thing is shaped, moment by moment, by its environment. A plant kept in darkness will bend and stretch and contort itself, desperately reaching toward whatever thin light it can find. Move it into full sun, and within weeks it looks like an entirely different organism. Not because its essential nature changed, but because the conditions around it changed, and it responded the way living things always respond, by growing toward whatever it's given. People are the same way, Drummond argues, more than most of us are comfortable admitting. We like to think of ourselves as fixed, as fully formed, as having a personality that is simply what it is. But we are, in truth, still growing, still bending toward whatever light or darkness surrounds us, every single day. This is not a comfortable thought if you've spent years in an environment, whether that's a group of people, a set of habits, or even just a pattern of thoughts, that has quietly been shaping you into someone you don't particularly like. But it's also, and this is the part that should genuinely lift a person's spirit, an enormously hopeful thought. Because it means the story isn't finished. It means whatever shape you've grown into so far isn't your final shape. It means change the light, and eventually, patiently, you change the plant. He spends a good portion of the book untangling what it actually means to become new, because he knew, even in his own time, that the word had already started to lose its meaning through overuse. People talked about turning over a new leaf the way they talked about the weather, a passing mood, a temporary resolution that everyone quietly expected to fade by the following month. He wanted something sturdier than that. He wanted to describe a change that reaches down into the actual structure of a person. The way a river doesn't just look different after a flood, it has genuinely carved a new path through the land, one that water will now naturally follow from that point forward. And this is where the book turns towards something almost tender. Because real change, the kind Drummond is describing, doesn't happen through force. It happens through relationship. He returns again and again to this idea that a person becomes new not by trying harder to be good, but by being drawn towards something or someone they love enough to be changed by. Think about how naturally this happens in ordinary life, without any spiritual language attached to it at all. A person falls in love, and suddenly they're paying attention to things they never noticed before. They're kinder in small ways they didn't used to be. They're willing to compromise on things that once felt non-negotiable. Nobody forced that change. It happened because they were in relationship with someone who mattered enough to shift the whole shape of how they moved through the world. Drummond takes that very human, very recognizable experience and suggests that this is closer to the truth of spiritual transformation than any list of rules could ever be. You don't become new by memorizing a code of conduct and forcing yourself to follow it through sheer discipline, though discipline certainly has its place. You become new the way a person becomes gentler after falling in love, the way a parent becomes braver after having a child, the way a soldier becomes more careful after nearly losing someone under his watch. Something outside yourself reaches in, and you are never quite the same size again. If you're enjoying this audiobook, please like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It helps the channel grow and allows more timeless books like this one to reach more people who might need exactly this kind of story today. There's a particular chapter in the book where Drummond talks about what he calls the environment of the soul, and it's worth pausing here, because this idea alone has quietly changed the way countless readers think about their daily lives. He points out that we are extraordinarily careful about our physical environment. We choose our climate if we can. We heat our homes in winter and cool them in summer. We know, without needing to be told, that a body left out in the cold too long will suffer, and a body kept in warmth and light will thrive. And yet, Drummond notices, we are remarkably careless about the environment of our inner lives. We'll spend years surrounded by cynicism, by resentment, by the low hum of people who have quietly given up on anything better, and we'll wonder why our own hope keeps freezing. This isn't a call to abandon difficult people or difficult circumstances. Drummond is careful about that, because life rarely offers us the luxury of a perfectly curated environment. But is a call to notice, And without excuses, what is actually shaping you day by day? What conversations do you keep returning to? What thoughts do you let linger the longest? What kind of person do you become after an hour spent in a particular company, or a particular mood, or a particular set of habits? Because whatever that environment is, Drummond would say, it is quietly doing to your character what sunlight does to a plant, whether you're paying attention to it or not. There's an old story, not unlike the kind Drummond loved to tell, about two seeds planted on the very same day in the very same garden. One fell near a wall, in a patch of shade that never quite cleared, and grew thin and pale, and always seemed to be reaching desperately for something just out of its grasp. The other fell in an open patch, full sun most of the day, and grew strong and full and steady. Nobody would ever say the first seed was defective. It simply grew in the conditions it was given. And Drummond's quiet insistence throughout this book is that human character works the same way far more often than we like to admit. We judge people, and sometimes we judge ourselves as though character were fixed at birth. Some are simply born strong, and some simply born weak. But so much of what we call weakness of character is really just a seed that never got its sunlight. This is not an excuse to avoid responsibility, and Drummond never lets it become one. He believed deeply that a person has agency, that a person can choose, deliberately and repeatedly, to move toward better light even when it isn't given to them freely. But he also believed that shaming people for the shape their character took in difficult soil was both cruel and scientifically inaccurate. The more useful question, he suggests, isn't why did you grow this way, but what would happen if you were planted somewhere new? Drummond then does something quite bold for a writer of his time, and honestly for a writer of any time. He takes the most famous description of love ever written, a passage so often read at weddings that many people have stopped actually hearing it, and he treats it not as poetry, but as a kind of instruction manual for what the new man is meant to become. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. Love is not easily provoked. Drummond looks at this list and says, essentially, this is not a description of a feeling. This is a description of a character. This is what the fully grown plant looks like once it's had enough time in the right light. And he does something clever with it, something that quietly reframes the entire book. He goes through each quality, patience, kindness, humility, and instead of treating them as separate virtues to be practiced individually, like items on a checklist, he treats them the way a botanist would treat the branches of a single tree, all growing from one root. You cannot, he argues, cultivate genuine patience while ignoring genuine humility, because impatience so often grows out of a hidden pride, the quiet belief that other people are moving too slowly toward what we, in our superior wisdom, already know they should be doing. Pull at the root, and the branches change together. Focus only on the branches, and you'll find yourself endlessly trimming the same stubborn growth, wondering why it always comes back. This connects to something Drummond returns to throughout the book, almost like a quiet refrain beneath everything else he's saying. He did not believe that people become good by trying to become good directly. He believed people become good as a side effect of loving something, or someone, more than they love their own comfort. Think of how strange and how true this actually is in ordinary life. Ask a mother who has spent a sleepless night caring for a sick child whether she was practicing patience, and she'll likely look at you with confusion. She wasn't practicing anything. She loved her child, and the patience simply followed, uninvited, because it had somewhere real to grow from. This is perhaps the most quietly radical idea in the entire book, and it's worth letting it sit for a long moment. We have been taught, most of us, that becoming a better person is primarily a matter of self-improvement, a private project undertaken alone. Willpower against weakness, discipline against desire. And there is a place for discipline. Drummond would never deny that. But he insists that the deepest and most lasting transformations rarely happen through sheer force of will. They happen through love. Through being loved well enough, and long enough, that you begin, almost without noticing, to love in return. And through that returning love, you find yourself becoming a person you couldn't have willed yourself into being through effort alone. There's something almost embarrassingly simple about this, and Drummond himself seems aware of it. In an age that loved complicated theological systems and elaborate moral frameworks, he was essentially saying, the whole of it comes down to this. Love, genuinely and patiently practiced, will do more to reshape a human character than any amount of white-knuckled self-discipline ever could. Not because discipline doesn't matter, but because discipline without love eventually runs out of fuel. while love, strangely, seems to generate its own. Drummond illustrates this with the patience of someone who has clearly watched real people struggle with real change, not just theorized about it from a distance. He talks about a man trying to overcome selfishness by sheer force of resolution, waking up every morning determined to think of others first, and failing again and again, exhausted by the effort of it, because he was trying to hold back a river with his bare hands. And then Drummond contrasts this with what happens when that same man falls deeply in love, or has a child, or finds a cause he genuinely cares about more than his own comfort. Suddenly, the selfishness doesn't require nearly as much effort to resist, because there's something else now occupying that space in him, something stronger than the old habit, growing in the same soil where selfishness used to live unchallenged. It's worth noticing how gentle this message actually is, underneath its scientific framing, because so much of what passes for moral instruction in Drummond's era and in our own carries an undertone of shame. Try harder. Do better. Stop failing. And Drummond, without ever softening the seriousness of the call to become a genuinely new person, refuses to build his argument on shame. He builds it on hope. He is essentially telling every reader, including the ones who have failed at becoming better 100 times before, that the failure wasn't proof of some deep personal defect. It was simply evidence that the right conditions hadn't yet been found. And conditions can change. That is in fact the entire premise of growth. There's a particular passage where Drummond talks about the slowness of real transformation, and it feels almost like a small act of mercy toward the reader. He compares it to the way a tree grows, imperceptibly, invisibly, day by day, so that no one watching it for a single afternoon would ever notice any difference at all. And yet, come back after 10 years, and the tree is unrecognizable. Towering, wide, deeply rooted, entirely different from the sapling it once was, even though at no single moment could anyone have pointed to the exact instant it changed. This is how Drummond wants us to understand our own becoming. Not as a dramatic overnight transformation, though those do happen sometimes, but far more often as a quiet, patient, almost invisible accumulation of small moments, small choices, small exposures to better light, until one day you look back and realize you are, in fact, someone quite different than you used to be, though you couldn't tell anyone the exact day it happened. This should feel enormously relieving to anyone listening who has grown discouraged in their own attempts to change. You are not failing simply because you cannot see the growth happening in real time. Almost nobody can see a tree growing while they're standing in front of it. You only see it in hindsight, in the space between who you were and who you've become, measured not in a single afternoon, but across seasons. Drummond also spends time on something that feels remarkably modern, given how long ago he was writing. And that is the idea that character is not, in fact, private. We tend to think of our inner transformation as something happening entirely within us, a personal project, invisible to everyone else until it produces some outward result. But Drummond points out, almost in passing, that character is more like weather than like a private diary. It affects everyone standing nearby, whether we intend it to or not. A person growing in patience doesn't just experience less internal frustration, they change the emotional climate of every room they walk into. A person growing in genuine humility doesn't just feel less need to prove themselves, they make space for other people to feel safe enough to be honest, to be vulnerable, to grow themselves. This means, Drummond suggests, though he never quite states it so bluntly, that becoming a new person is never entirely a private act. It ripples outward, quietly reshaping the people around you, the way one warm day in early spring can be felt by every plant in a garden, not just the one closest to the sun. Think of someone in your own life who carries a particular kind of steadiness, a person who somehow makes every room they enter feel a little calmer, a little safer, a little more hopeful. That steadiness didn't appear by accident. Somewhere along the way, in soil we'll never fully see, that person was shaped by patience and love, and difficult seasons survived. And now, without even trying, they are quietly shaping everyone around them in return. This is where the book takes its most tender turn, and it's the turn that has kept it alive for well over a century, long after most of Drummond's other writings faded into academic footnotes. Because underneath all the language of growth and environment and cultivation, there is a single, aching hope running through every page. The hope that no one is stuck. The hope that whatever shape your character has grown into, through no particular fault or virtue entirely your own, given the conditions you were handed, that shape is not final. The hope that light, real light, love, patience, a better environment, sustained attention over time, can genuinely change what grows in the soil of a human heart, no matter how long the weeds have had the run of the place. There's a story near the heart of the book, drawn again from Paul's own writing, that Drummond returns to more than once, and it deserves to be told plainly here. Paul, describing his own inner struggle, admits something almost shockingly honest for someone who had become one of the great moral teachers of his tradition. He confesses that he does not always do the good he wants to do, and he sometimes does the very thing he hates. Drummond doesn't rush past this confession the way many teachers might, eager to get to the triumphant resolution. He lingers on it. He wants his readers to understand that even the man who became new, even the man whose transformation is held up as one of history's great examples, still wrestled, still stumbled, still felt the old pull of the old self, long after the new self had begun to grow. This matters enormously, because it means becoming new was never meant to be understood as arriving at some permanent finish line, after which struggle simply ends. It was meant to be understood as an ongoing relationship, a continual turning toward the light, again and again, especially on the days when turning away would have been so much easier. The new man, in Drummond's telling, is not someone who never struggles. He is someone who has found in the middle of the struggle something worth turning toward over and over, until the turning itself becomes a kind of second nature. There's something quietly beautiful in how ordinary Drummond makes all of this sound once you strip away the century-old language. He is not describing an elite spiritual achievement reserved for saints and scholars. He is describing something available to absolutely anyone willing to change what they're planted in. A tired parent, a struggling worker, a person who has failed at their own resolutions more times than they can count. None of them are excluded from this process, because the process was never about being impressive enough to deserve transformation. It was always about being willing enough to be planted somewhere new, and patient enough to let the growing happen in its own time. Drummond closes his reflections with an image that has stayed with readers for generations. An image so simple it almost slips past you the first time you hear it, and yet it carries the entire weight of the book inside it. He compares the process of becoming a new man to nothing more dramatic than the slow work of the seasons themselves. Winter does not become spring through force. It does not happen because the frozen ground clenches its fists and wills itself warmer. It happens because something greater moves closer, patiently, faithfully, and the earth, in response, simply begins to thaw. The frost doesn't fight the sun. It simply cannot remain frost once real warmth arrives. And this, in the end, is the quiet invitation sitting at the center of the new man. Not an invitation to fight harder against everything you don't like about yourself. Not an invitation to another exhausting list of resolutions destined to fade by the time the season changes. But an invitation to notice what you have been planted in, and to consider, honestly and without shame, whether it might be time to move toward better light. To let something greater than your own effort draw the change out of you, the way spring draws green out of ground that looked, only weeks before, like it would never grow anything again. If this story stayed with you, explore the audiobook library and discover more books waiting for you. Stories chosen not because they're old, but because they still have something true to say to whoever is ready to hear it. Somewhere, right now, there is a person who has tried and failed to become someone better more times than they can count. Somewhere there is a person who has stopped believing that real change is even possible for them anymore, who has quietly decided that this is simply who they are, and always will be. And if there is one thing worth carrying forward from Henry Drummond's small, patient, hopeful book, it's this. The frost does not get the final word, not in nature, and not in the human heart. Something warmer is always moving closer, if you're willing to turn toward it, season after season, however long it takes, however many false starts came before, until one quiet day, without any fireworks or thunderclaps at all, you look at your own life and realize that something in you has, gently and unmistakably, become new.